Sarah had been my maid of honor, my emergency contact, and my closest confidant for 15 years. When postpartum depression nearly destroyed me after my son was born, she was the friend who held me together and kept my family functioning. What I discovered 8 months later was that she had used my mental health crisis as a strategic opportunity to seduce my husband and steal the life she had always envied. My name is Emma Collins, and I'm about to tell you how the person I trusted most in the world turned my postpartum depression into a weapon against me. This isn't just about friendship betrayal or marital infidelity. It's about how predators disguise themselves as supporters and exploit our most vulnerable moments to destroy everything we hold dear. Sarah Matthews and I had been inseparable since college. We were each other's bridesmaids, shared every secret, and planned our futures as if they were intertwined forever. When I married David in 2019, Sarah gave a tearful maid of honor speech about how happy she was that I had found my soulmate. When David and I struggled with infertility for 3 years, Sarah was the friend who held me through every negative pregnancy test and failed treatment cycle. So when I finally became pregnant with our son Jacob in 2022, Sarah was almost as excited as we were. She helped plan the baby shower, painted the nursery, and promised to be the most devoted honorary aunt any child could have. I genuinely believed that Sarah's joy for our growing family was as pure and selfless as it appeared. Jacob was born on March 15th, 2023, after a difficult labor that left me physically and emotionally exhausted. But what started as normal postpartum fatigue quickly evolved into something much darker and more frightening. Within weeks of Jacob's birth, I was experiencing severe postpartum depression that made it nearly impossible for me to function as a mother or wife. The depression felt like drowning while everyone around me continued their normal lives. I couldn't bond with Jacob, couldn't sleep even when he was sleeping, and felt overwhelming guilt about my inability to experience the joy that motherhood was supposed to bring. Some days, I couldn't get out of bed. Other days, I would cry for hours without understanding why. David was supportive but overwhelmed. He was trying to care for a newborn, manage his demanding job, and help his wife through a mental health crisis that neither of us fully understood. He encouraged me to seek professional help, but finding appropriate postpartum mental health services proved more difficult than we had anticipated. That's when Sarah stepped in as my savior. "Emma, you don't have to go through this alone," Sarah said during one of my darkest moments. "Let me help with Jacob, with the house, with whatever you need. David needs support too, and I want to make sure your family gets through this together." I was so grateful for Sarah's offer that I didn't question her motives or consider whether her level of involvement might be inappropriate. She began spending most days at our house, caring for Jacob when I couldn't, preparing meals when I was too depressed to eat, and keeping the household functioning when I was barely surviving. Sarah also became David's primary emotional support system during this period. She listened to his frustrations about my condition, offered advice about postpartum depression that she had researched online, and provided the companionship that I was unable to give him due to my mental health struggles. "David is such a good husband," Sarah would tell me. "Not every man would be so patient and understanding about postpartum depression. You're so lucky to have someone who stands by you during your worst moments." I agreed completely. David was being incredibly supportive, and Sarah's presence was making it possible for our family to survive my mental health crisis. I felt guilty about my inability to care for my own child, and grateful that Sarah was filling the gaps in my capacity as a mother and wife. But I began noticing subtle changes in the dynamics between Sarah and David that made me uncomfortable, even though I couldn't articulate exactly what was wrong. They seemed to have developed inside jokes and shared references that didn't include me. They would stop talking when I entered rooms, claiming they were discussing boring household logistics or strategies for helping me feel better. Most concerning, Sarah began making comments about my relationship with David that seemed designed to increase my insecurity about our marriage. She would mention how tired David looked, how stressed he seemed about my condition, and how difficult it must be for him to maintain romantic feelings for someone who was struggling with mental health issues. "Emma, I think you should know that David is really worried about your recovery timeline," Sarah said one afternoon while I was holding Jacob. "He's been asking me if postpartum depression usually lasts this long and whether you'll ever be the same person he married." These comments always felt like supportive warnings from a concerned friend, but they consistently increased my anxiety about my marriage and my worthiness as a wife and mother. Sarah had a talent for expressing concern in ways that made me more insecure rather than more confident. I started questioning whether David was truly as supportive as he seemed, or whether he was beginning to resent my inability to fulfill my roles as wife and mother. Sarah's observations about his stress and fatigue seemed to confirm my worst fears about being a burden on my family. "Maybe David would be happier with someone who could actually be a real partner," I confided to Sarah during one of my lowest moments. "I can't even take care of my own baby half the time." "Don't think like that," Sarah replied, though her tone sounded more resigned than reassuring. "David chose you, and he's committed to working through this. But you do need to focus on getting better for everyone's sake." As my depression continued through the summer of 2023, Sarah's involvement in our household became even more extensive. She was spending entire days at our house, often arriving before David left for work and staying until after dinner. She had become essential to our family's functioning, and I was increasingly dependent on her support. But I also began feeling like a stranger in my own home. Sarah knew where everything was, had established routines for Jacob's care, and seemed to anticipate David's needs better than I could in my depressed state. Sometimes I felt like I was visiting someone else's life rather than living my own. The turning point came in October 2023, when I was finally starting to respond to therapy and medication for my postpartum depression. I was beginning to feel more like myself and was eager to reclaim my roles as mother and wife. But when I tried to resume normal responsibilities, I discovered that Sarah and David had developed systems and routines that didn't really include me. "Emma, are you sure you're ready to take over Jacob's bedtime routine?" Sarah asked when I expressed interest in putting my own son to bed. "David and I have gotten him on such a good schedule, and we don't want to disrupt his progress." It was a reasonable concern, but it made me feel like an outsider in my own family. Sarah and David had become a parenting team, and I was the unstable element who might disrupt their effective partnership. That's when I started paying closer attention to the dynamic between Sarah and David, and what I observed made my stomach turn. They moved around each other in our kitchen with the familiarity of a couple. They communicated through glances and gestures that suggested intimate understanding. They touched each other casually, a hand on the shoulder, a brief contact while passing in hallways, in ways that seemed more romantic than friendly. Most telling, they both seemed to forget I was in the room during conversations, speaking to each other with an ease and connection that I hadn't experienced with David since before Jacob's birth. They looked like a couple, acted like a couple, and treated me like an inconvenient third party in my own marriage. I decided to test my suspicions by pretending to leave for a therapy appointment, but instead parking down the street and walking back to observe the house from outside. What I saw through our living room window confirmed my worst fears. David and Sarah were sitting closer together on our couch than any married man should sit with his wife's best friend. They were talking intimately, and as I watched, Sarah reached over and kissed David in a way that was unmistakably romantic and sexual. My husband and my best friend were having an affair, and they had been conducting it in my home while using my mental health crisis as cover for their relationship. I stood outside my own house watching my life being stolen by the two people I trusted most, and realized that my postpartum depression hadn't just been a personal struggle. It had been an opportunity for predators who had been waiting for me to become vulnerable enough to exploit. But I didn't confront them immediately. Instead, I decided to gather evidence and understand the full scope of their betrayal before taking action. I installed hidden cameras in our home, began recording their conversations, and started documenting their affair systematically. What I discovered over the following weeks was even worse than I had imagined. Sarah and David weren't just having a casual affair. They were planning a life together that involved removing me from the picture entirely. Their recorded conversations revealed that they had been discussing how to minimize David's financial obligations to me in a divorce, how to gain custody of Jacob, and how to present their relationship to our families and friends as a natural development that had grown out of Sarah's support during my mental health crisis. "Once Emma is more stable, we can start transitioning toward the divorce," David said in one recorded conversation. "Sarah, you've been so much better for Jacob than Emma ever was, even before the depression. I think any court would see that he'd be better off with us." "I've been documenting all of Emma's worst moments," Sarah replied. "Her inability to care for Jacob, the days she couldn't get out of bed, the times she said she wished she'd never had a baby. If we need to use that for custody, I have everything ready." They had been systematically building a case against me as an unfit mother, while presenting themselves as the stable, loving couple who could provide Jacob with the family he deserved. My postpartum depression, which was a treatable medical condition, was being weaponized against me by the people who had promised to support my recovery. But they had also made crucial mistakes that would become the foundation for their destruction. Their arrogance about their plan had made them careless about hiding evidence, and their belief that I was too mentally unstable to threaten them had made them underestimate my ability to fight back. In December 2023, I contacted attorney Jennifer Walsh, who specialized in divorce cases involving mental health issues and custody disputes. When I explained my situation and provided the evidence I had gathered, Attorney Walsh was immediately alarmed by the scope of David and Sarah's conspiracy. "Emma, what you've documented isn't just adultery, it's systematic psychological abuse and conspiracy to commit fraud in custody proceedings," Attorney Walsh explained. "They've been deliberately damaging your mental health while creating evidence to use against you. This could constitute actionable emotional abuse." Attorney Walsh helped me develop a comprehensive legal strategy that would expose David and Sarah's affair while protecting my parental rights and ensuring fair treatment in divorce proceedings. We also contacted my therapist to document my progress in recovering from postpartum depression and to establish that my mental health issues were temporary and treatable, rather than permanent conditions that would affect my parenting ability. The confrontation came on Christmas morning 2023, when Sarah arrived at our house to spend the holiday with her family, meaning David and Jacob. I had invited my parents and David's parents to join us for Christmas breakfast, supposedly to celebrate my recovery and our family's return to normalcy. As everyone gathered in our living room to exchange gifts, I announced that I had a special presentation about our journey through postpartum depression and the people who had helped us survive it. I played selected recordings of David and Sarah's conversations about their affair, their plans for divorce, and their strategy for gaining custody of Jacob. The room fell completely silent as our families heard the two people they had admired for supporting me during my mental health crisis revealed themselves as predators who had exploited my vulnerability. "This is the woman I trusted to be my son's godmother," I said, looking directly at Sarah. And this is the man I trusted to love me in sickness and in health. They turned my postpartum depression into an opportunity to steal my child and destroy my family. Sarah's face went completely white as she realized the scope of evidence I had gathered. David looked like he was going to be sick, as he understood that his carefully planned life with Sarah was collapsing in real time. "Emma, you're taking those conversations out of context," David stammered. "We were just trying to figure out what was best for Jacob if your depression didn't improve." "The context," I replied, "is that you were having an affair with my best friend while I was suffering from a treatable medical condition, and you were planning to use my illness against me in custody proceedings. There's no other context that matters." Both sets of parents were horrified by what they had heard. David's mother, who had always treated Sarah like a family member, looked at her with disgust and disappointment. My father, who had been grateful to Sarah for helping during my depression, appeared to be struggling with anger and disbelief. But Sarah tried one final manipulation attempt. "Emma, your depression made you paranoid and suspicious. David and I never intended for this to happen, but you became so difficult to live with that we found comfort in each other. We were going to wait until you were better to tell you." "You found comfort in each other," I repeated. "Is that what you call systematically documenting my worst moments to use against me in custody court? Is that what you call planning to present yourselves as Jacob's real parents while I was trying to recover from a medical condition?" The divorce proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. The evidence of David's affair and the conspiracy to use my mental health against me resulted in a settlement heavily in my favor. I received primary custody of Jacob, the house, and substantial financial support. David was granted supervised visitation until he could demonstrate that he wouldn't expose Jacob to inappropriate relationships. Sarah's life imploded even more dramatically. Her employer terminated her when they learned about her role in systematically abusing someone with postpartum depression. Her family distanced themselves from her when they understood how she had exploited my mental health crisis. Most of her other friendships ended when people realized the kind of person who could betray a best friend during their most vulnerable time. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was that David and Sarah's relationship didn't survive the exposure of their conspiracy. Once their affair was no longer a secret adventure that made them feel clever and superior, they discovered that their connection had been based primarily on shared betrayal rather than genuine love. David realized that Sarah had been manipulating him just as much as she had been manipulating me, using his frustration with my depression to justify an affair he would never have considered during normal circumstances. Sarah realized that David was weak enough to betray his wife during her mental health crisis, which meant he would likely betray her if she ever became inconvenient. Their relationship ended in mutual recrimination and blame, with each accusing the other of initiating the conspiracy and manipulating the situation for personal gain. The life they had planned to build on the ruins of my family never materialized because it had been founded on deception and exploitation rather than love. For me, the resolution of their betrayal marked the beginning of true recovery from both postpartum depression and the trauma of discovering that my closest relationships had been weapons used against me. I learned that healing requires not just medical treatment, but also the removal of toxic people who exploit vulnerability. I now work with postpartum support organizations to help new mothers identify signs of exploitation during mental health crises and protect themselves from people who might use their struggles against them. My experience with Sarah and David has helped other women recognize similar betrayals and take protective action. The most important lesson from this experience is that postpartum depression is a medical condition, not a character flaw or permanent disability. People who truly support recovery don't use mental health struggles as opportunities for personal gain or as weapons in relationship conflicts. Sarah thought she could use my postpartum depression to steal my husband and child while presenting herself as the hero who had stepped in when I couldn't function. She thought my mental health struggles made me too weak and confused to recognize her betrayal or fight back effectively. But she underestimated the strength that comes from surviving both mental illness and personal betrayal. Her exploitation of my vulnerability became the evidence that exposed her true character and destroyed the life she had tried to steal from me. The friendship she had pretended to maintain while seducing my husband became the trust she had violated beyond repair. The support she had offered during my mental health crisis became the manipulation she had used to justify her betrayal. And the family she had tried to steal became the family she would never be part of. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are those who know exactly where we're most vulnerable. But that knowledge can also become their greatest weakness when we're strong enough to document their exploitation and seek justice. Sarah learned that exploiting someone's postpartum depression isn't just morally reprehensible. It's also a strategy that backfires when the victim recovers and realizes how their trust was violated. Her perfect plan to steal my life became the perfect evidence of her character, and that evidence destroyed everything she had hoped to gain.